Alright, so what I wanted to do to start with is to let you know a little bit about what transforming communication is and where it's come from. So transforming communication is a model of communication and a model of relationships, and it's drawn from a number of places and a number of different sources. So for example, it comes initially from the world of NLP, and NLP is something that we have our own training in. And the guy that designed this, who's a New Zealand guy by the name of Richard Bolstad, is an internationally renowned trainer of NLP. So we're going to show you a little bit during this course what NLP is and what that's all about. It comes from the research of a number of other people as well. So one of the people who you've probably already heard about, because you probably read about him and some of the material that helped you make the decision to come along today, is a guy called John Gottman. And John Gottman was really interested in this idea of, is it possible to predict which relationships will last and which ones won't? And so what he did is he got a whole bunch of couples together, heterosexual, gay, lesbian, across the board, and videoed them for a couple of days, did some interviews, did some videos, and then followed them up over a 12-year period. And what he discovered is when he went back and he looked at the video from that initial 2-day period, he could take 5 minutes, any 5 minutes, and predict with 96% accuracy whether or not that couple would be together in 12 years or not. And that by itself is remarkable, but what's even more remarkable is that if they weren't going to be together, he could predict with 80% accuracy which year they were going to break up. So you could have a look at 5 minutes, it could be they didn't have to be arguing or discussing anything important, just any 5 minutes, and he'd be able to say whether or not they're going to be together in 12 years, and if not, he'd be able to say, well, they'll last 6 years, but they'll break up in the 7th year, and he'd be right 4/5 of the time. So that's quite extraordinary. We don't get that kind of predictive ability very much in the social sciences. So it's the work of Gottman and a number of other people that have gone into putting this session together. So let's have a look at, first of all, what the 4 days contains. And to explain that, let me explain that we run this in a number of different ways. So what you're on for this session is a generalized form of transforming communications. We also run this directly for businesses in a business environment, particularly to help managers understand how to work with their staff and to help customer-facing staff understand how to work better with customers. It's been run, for example, at high levels in major government departments like Inland Revenue. When Inland Revenue Department had some issues where their people were ringing people up to ask for money and not doing it in a very useful way, people were getting very upset and in some cases killing themselves. So they started to run the Transforming Communication Seminar and started to turn that around in a fairly significant way. And Carlene's got some specific first-hand experience of that that she can talk to you about as well. This is run in schools for teachers, and what's interesting is we discover when we run this for teachers so that they communicate with their students in a more effective way, suddenly the students start communicating with each other in a more effective way. So that's a very interesting thing to notice as well. And of course it's run a lot for parents and for couples who want to reinforce, strengthen, and in some cases even save their relationships. So let's have a look at the core components. So the first thing we're looking at here is making sure you've got the ability to set achievable goals. Now, why is this important? Well, one of the things that Gottman discovered is that successful relationships are not just about resolving conflicts. If all you're doing is resolving conflicts, that will take away some of the nastier stuff that happens, but it's not enough to keep the relationship going. If you look at this in a business context, one of the things that makes businesses successful is the amount of energy in the business, the amount of energy people bring to work with them. That drives things like discretionary effort, how long people are willing to stay, both in terms of on a day-to-day basis, but how long they're prepared to stay with the organisation. And that all comes about by having them feel like they're part of something important, that they are pursuing goals that are important to them and that they have some sort of autonomy over. Now, in personal relationships, that seems to be the case as well. When we look at successful couples, it's not just that they're good at resolving disagreements. It's that when they're having those times when there are no disagreements, they understand very clearly what's important to each other, what each other's goals are. They may have specific goals for the relationship, but more than that, it's about understanding, well, what goals are important to me, and how am I getting support on that, and what goals are important to this other person, and how can I support them with that. Because one of the things that happens when you start to get a bit more goal focused is you activate the goal seeking part of the brain in the front here. And that's a very conscious part of the brain. Without any goals, we tend to work much more out of the unconscious parts of the brain, and what that's operating out of often is the unconscious behaviours that have been stacked in there in our childhood. So we end up replicating the same sort of parenting behaviours that we learned from our parents. Now, if you had great parents that were doing all the right things all the time, that's great, but many of us find there's things that we'd like to tweak. So we need practice operating out of this more conscious decision-making part of the brain, and that's all about setting achievable goals. Now, most people set goals in a way that is not achievable, and I'm not talking about the scope of the goal, I'm talking about how they actually structure the goal. So we're going to show you how to set goals in a way that absolutely maximises your engagement in the goal and your chances of achieving them. We're also going to show you how to do this thing we call accessing resourceful states. Because one of the things you'll notice is you can go on any training program you like and be given the best skills in the world, but if you can't keep yourself calm, if you get too upset, then you don't have the ability to access those skills. So it's often not so much a question of our ability as our ability to access our ability when it matters. And this is certainly what was found in Gottman's research as well. What he noticed was that when couples were in a dispute about something, and because he was measuring a whole bunch of stuff about what they were doing while they were talking, he was able to notice that, you know what, if one of those individuals has their pulse rate go above 95 beats per minute during that conversation, then you're pretty much going to leave behind any hope of constructive conversation. So it doesn't matter what skills we give you if we don't give you the ability to keep yourself calm. So this is what we mean by accessing resourceful states. We're going to show you how, even in the midst of some fairly trying conversations at times, how do I keep that pulse rate below 95 beats per minute so I can access the skills that I want to use when I want to use them. Rather than looking back on it later and thinking, I'm not quite sure why I said that thing that I said that made the thing blow up even more, I wish I'd said this instead. We'll give you the ability to do that in the moment. One of the questions we often get is, well, what's John Gottman looking for in that first 5 minutes? So we're going to show you that today. On the first day of the course, we're going to show you what it is that John Gottman's looking for that will predict success. But not only that, what Gottman found is when he was able to show people that, he was able to show them if something's not going right, what to do differently in order to get a better result. So one of the key things that he noticed is that when couples have solid relationships, whether they're disagreeing or whether they're talking about something important or something inconsequential, they do this thing he called synchronizing. In other words, they start to sit in the same posture as the other person, they start to breathe at the same rate, their brain waves start to synchronize, they tend to nod in time to each other. Even when they disagree with the other person. So somebody will be here going, yep, okay, yeah, I understand, I've got it, yep. Well, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard. And that's all right that they disagree, because there's a synchronization going on around the disagreement. So we're going to show you today specifically how to build that synchronization into your conversations, so that you get the sense of, even when we're disagreeing, there's the sense of connection that allows us to have a useful discussion. And that involves some very specific things about what you're doing with your voice, what you're doing with your body language, and even what you're doing with your own language. And we'll show you how to do that. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that you understand how to select the correct communication skill for the appropriate situation. This is a 4-day course, and sometimes people say, well, can we come to just the first 2 days or the last 2 days? That seems to be the bit that we want. And it doesn't really work that way, because in my view, in my experience, one of the biggest problems people have with communication is not that they've never been exposed to any good skills, it's that they've only ever been exposed to one skill at a time. So somebody goes one and they do a course on, say, reflective listening, which is a fantastic skill. It's very well researched in terms of its effectiveness, and it's really useful in certain situations. But it's the old story. If your only tool is a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail, and you start to use the wrong skill at the wrong time. So suddenly you're sitting around the dinner table and somebody's saying, could you pass me the salt, please? And you're saying, so I see, so you're really feeling like you like some salt right now, I understand. Right? And that's a really good way to get a plate thrown at you. Because in that situation, the person didn't want you to acknowledge and reflect, they just wanted the salt. So this is the problem. People end up with a particular communication skill, and then they try that in every situation, and suddenly they've just become that person that's been on an annoying training course and trying to use the same thing all the time. So there's at least 4, even 5 different situations that you might find yourself in. So what we're going to show you is how to quickly identify what the situation is, and therefore reach the precise tool that's going to work in that situation. Because it turns out that if you use the wrong tool in the wrong situation, not only will it not work, it can actually make things a lot worse. And I'm sure some of you have experienced that as we have in the past. The next thing on my list here is we're going to show you how to help others solve problems. Now, I say that again, particularly for any managers in the room, because managers in particularly often mishear this. Because what they thought I just said was, we're going to show you how to solve others' problems. Do you get the difference there? We're going to tell you how to help others solve their problems. So for example, when I work a lot with leaders in organisations, and sometimes with people who are very new to leadership, as well as at the senior level. And when I work with people who are new to leadership, there's a couple of things that I find they're doing which is making life pretty difficult for themselves. So one thing is they've got this idea that, I used to just have to look after myself, now I've got a team of 12, so now I've got to solve 12 people's problems instead of just solving my own problems. When of course that's not really the role of the leader at all. The role of the leader is to empower people to better solve their own problems. If you're not doing that, if you're just solving people's problems for them, that's called micromanagement, and it drives a drop in engagement. If you're helping others to solve their own problems, the research is very clear that that becomes a motivational factor. Much more important than things like commission structures or financial incentives. When people feel like they have autonomy, in other words, they have the ability to solve their own problems and generate their own results, it's a much more motivating and engaging way to live your life. So, oftentimes when people are really good at solving problems for themselves, they want to help others solve problems in a way which involves, let me give you the advice, let me tell you what you should do. So we're going to show you why that doesn't work and what to do instead, so that people can solve their own problems and don't need you around to solve them in the future. The other thing that leaders sometimes do, particularly when they are new to leadership, is they get this idea that, well, I've got to put everyone else first and my needs come last. Because I'm the leader, so I need to give out, and eventually my needs become subservient to everyone else's needs. The parents in the room may recognise that as something that happens with parents sometimes as well, and it turns out it's not very useful. Because when your needs aren't being met, that has a way of bubbling up in sometimes some quite unuseful ways. So one of the things we're going to show you is how to usefully assert your own needs so that you can get what you want, when you can adjust other people's behaviour so that you can get more of what you need and what you want. Now again, if we go back to John Gottman, what he discovered is that when somebody was looking to assert their needs and ask somebody to, say, change some behaviour, you can predict with 92% accuracy how that conversation is going to end up from the very first sentence. So we can listen to the first sentence of somebody saying, look, I'd really like it if this happened, and we can tell you with 92% accuracy how that's likely to end up. So we're going to show you how to precisely construct that very first sentence. Now, if it turns out you don't like doing it that way and you prefer to do it the way you have always done it, and if that way is quite different to what we're going to be suggesting, then that's okay. You've still got an 8% chance of it working out all right. But if you're going to play the odds, then it pays to go with the 92%. So we're going to show you how to go about doing that. Now, it turns out sometimes you might have some needs, but other people have got their own needs as well, and so you get this thing called conflict. So we're going to spend some time on the second half of the course looking at how do we resolve conflicts. This is what research tells us is the number one thing managers are looking for in their trainings. So Harvard did some research in 2013, and what they discovered was the thing that managers want most training on, the thing that takes most time out of their day in doing the job they feel they should be doing, is having to spend time resolving conflicts. We find very similar things within families. And the thing about resolving conflicts is it's important to realise there's more than one type of conflict. And again, it's important that you're able to differentiate which type of conflict am I in. Because what resolves the conflict in one style of conflict, again, will not just not help, but will actually make matters worse if you try to use it in a different type of conflict. So we're going to be showing you how to identify what kind of conflict you're in, and again, what's the appropriate communication model, what's the appropriate tool to solve the conflict in a way that, number one, both parties feel good about it, and number two, that the conflict stays resolved. Because when we look at what happens in families, for example, what we discover is there's not a whole heap of different conflicts that are going on. There's 3 or 4 that just keep surfacing again and again and again. So we're going to show you how to resolve that in a way that it doesn't have to keep resurfacing, that you can solve it and then it stays solved. To do that, you're going to need a lot of these skills that we've already talked about. So you can start to appreciate there's a lot in here, and this is why this is a 4-day course. This is not a 1-day, once over lightly, here's a hammer and go and treat everything like an hour type course. We're giving you a very fully fitted toolkit and the ability to identify which tool is appropriate at which moment. And the final thing here is, I've got it down here as being able to influence others. What we mean by that is oftentimes managers, co-workers and family members will tell us that, you know, the problem isn't so much that I want them to do something differently. I can kind of get them to do that. The problem is their attitude. So for example, teachers will say, you know, I can stand over them and get them to do their work when I'm watching them, but that's not the problem. The problem is their attitude. Or somebody will say, look, if I start to order people around and tell them to pick up their stuff out of the lounge, I can get them to do that, but the problem is their attitude around tidiness or their attitude around just letting things go. And that's what people really want to be able to influence, is people's attitudes. So we're going to show you how to do that, and it's going to require a little bit of expertise in everything that comes before it. So our job is to give you some expertise in all of these other areas. And when it's appropriate, you can then start to use that to influence people at the values and attitudinal level. Now, as I say that, it occurs to you, you want to be careful how you do that, because to influence somebody at that level is a fairly significant thing and a fairly significant impact on their life. So you might want to start thinking about, well, when would it be appropriate to use that kind of ability, and when would it be more appropriate just to let things go. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So that's the kind of overview of the 4 days. The way we're going to do this is through a mixture of sharing with you some research, showing you some models that work, and lots of practice. Lots of stories that show you how it's worked for others in the past so that you can process how that works in your own life. And lots of little exercises that will help you develop the expertise that allow you to take it back and make it useful in your own life, whether that's at home, whether that's at work, whether that's in other social contexts you operate in. And what most people tell me after they've been on the course is, hey look, I came on the course because I wanted it for this particular context, maybe work, but I found I'm using it a lot at home. Or I came on it because I wanted to, you know, work on some of my family relationships, and it's made me so much more effective in the business context. And we'll be encouraging that. We'll be encouraging you to think about what are all the different places you could use any one of these tools. So it starts to become just a core piece of who you are and how you interact with others.